There are so many myths surrounding the Beatles that it can sometimes be hard to tell truth from fiction. Our guest this week has dedicated years to thoroughly investigating the history of the band to ensure his many books on them are built on fact. Kenneth Womack joins us fresh from releasing the second part of his biography of Beatles producer George Martin. I'm Ellen Kirwin.
And I'm Laura Davis, and this is the Beatles City podcast. So, Ellen, I suppose with a band as big as the Beatles, it makes sense that there are many, many myths surrounding them and that stories have sort of spun out of control.
Yeah, well, that's true. George Martin actually started one of the myths himself, and it was that he was so adamant that he went to the cabin to watch John and Paul play in the early years before they were ever the Beatles, and, you know, he had it in his head that he knew back then that they were really talented and they were going to be the Beatles and they were going to sell so many records, but it's simply not true. He didn't go and see them perform until the first album was very much underway, and that's when he saw them perform in that setting. But I think over the years, he just almost got it in his head and convinced himself that he'd been there from the very start, and it wasn't the case.
That's really strange. So I guess your memory can play tricks on you, even though you were there.
Yeah, well, he probably almost wanted that to be true, and it wasn't the case.
So how did Kenneth Martin track this down and work out that he hadn't been there?
A lot of interviews and speaking to people who were there at the time and reading between the lines. He'd take 5 different people's perspective on one thing that happened, and somehow in between all those 5 different scenarios there would be the truth.
So he's got quite a unique perspective because he's had access to all this material.
Well, yes, definitely. I mean, people we've spoken to previously have all been there at the time, but Ken wasn't there. However, he's got all this knowledge from speaking to people who were there at the time, so he can paint a really nice picture about what actually happened back then. I'm speaking to Kenneth Womack, who is a Beatles expert. I'm right in saying that. Is that right, Ken?
It is absolutely right.
And, you know, you've wrote more than 30 books over the years. Many of them are to do with the Beatles. And most recently, you've wrote the biography for George Martin, his later years, and that got released in September this year. Is that right?
It absolutely is. Very proud to be George's biographer.
Well, you know, with someone like you being such a big fan of the Beatles, why is it that you decided to really delve into the past of George?
Well, that's a great question. And for me, you know, the Beatles offer such a wonderful story about art and the creation of great music and really timeless music, right? That we still think about these many years later. And the question for me, and it really still is in many ways, is who was the person who would receive all of this great music? And that person was George Martin. And so I was interested in writing a story, a narrative, in this case, a biography that would look at this great achievement from the point of view of the person who received the music almost in its originary form. And sometimes George was the first audience for the latest Lennon and McCartney songs. And if he weren't the first audience, he may have been, you know, the secondary or tertiary audience. So I wanted to understand that fascinating story and that achievement from the point of view of that privileged position.
Yeah, well, you know, he was known as the 5th Beatle. I think even McCartney himself said that. So he was really integral to the whole process of the Beatles, really.
Absolutely. And I sometimes say, and this could be a little controversial, so get ready. There are times when he's the 2nd or the 3rd Beatle. Because, you know, his level of enthusiasm and passion for a given moment in their project was greater than some of the others. So, you know, it really depends on which song and which moment during their career we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. So how did the process start? I mean, it's quite a big feat. It's quite a big thing to do what you have managed to do. So, you know, was it really overwhelming at the start, or was it refreshing? How did you feel and how did you start that process?
Well, it was quite overwhelming, really. Part of it is the sheer breadth of the story. George lives a long life. And for that reason, you know, there's a lot of years and material to account for. I wanted to try to self-consciously find something new to say about the Beatles, about George. So, you know, it was important to ferret out interviews where I was able to get a little bit new information, a little bit of new perspective. But again, that's not easy because of the long nature of their story. So I was forced to contend with that in a way. But really trying to lay it out and create a very accurate storyline is always challenging because there's so many different discrepant versions of the Beatles story out there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So coming up with one that is arguable and historically accurate was really the challenge. And there would be moments, by the way, while writing these particular books when I was going with what I believe was the standard understanding of a particular moment in Beatles history, only to find out that something was vastly wrong. And I would literally have to go back, pages and rewrite something, sometimes having to rewrite an entire story arc because I was realizing that something that we had sort of generally and universally come to believe wasn't true.
Well, yeah, I think with something as big as the Beatles, you're always going to get gossip. You're always going to get stories that are just twisted ever so slightly. But, as they're told year after year, they change really drastically. So what was maybe one of the biggest things that changed and you had to go back during the process?
Well, one of them was actually in volume one. There was George liked to believe that he had gone up to the cavern very, very early in their career to listen to them and get a sense of them for himself.
Mm-hmm.
That was probably an error caused by many decades having come between him and the originary event. He does go to the cavern, but it's actually much later in the fall of 1962 after they've decided that they're going to make an album. He's considering making a live record for the Please Please Me inaugural album by the Beatles. So there would be issues of timing. And in that case, I thought I had a really great, exciting moment in the summer of 1962 where George goes up to the cavern, and it just wasn't true. And I was getting some of it from his memoir, All You Need Is Ears. And I was excited because I thought I was going to create a great story arc.
Wow, well, yeah, I thought that was true as well. I sort of had the impression that George went when they were really early on in the career to see them in the cavern, but I guess that's not the case.
It was the case, but it was later, and so it kind of threw a wrench into my storyline. But you're right about your other point, too, and that is people have created so many mythologies over the years about who played what and recorded what. I was seeing something just yesterday evening that had George going back in the weekend before Sgt. Pepper was released with Paul McCartney, and the two of them were redoing some of Sgt. Pepper, and it was simply garbage, just completely made up out of whole cloth. This notion that they went in after everybody was done and re-recorded and remixed part of the album. That didn't happen. Another great one that you hear a lot is that Paul would secretly go in and re-record Ringo's drum parts after hours.
I've heard that a few times.
That still comes up today. Yeah. And, I give a lot of talks, and when these points come up, there's not a lot I can do other than saying, that's really just not true.
Mm-hmm.
That they didn't operate that way. Ringo was a professional drummer, and while there are a couple of moments where Paul plays drums, there wasn't some covert, activity going on. And George Martin certainly didn't covertly go back in and remix Sgt. Pepper with only Paul present, as this person alleged, actually on a pretty reputable magazine that I saw last night. So, there are just so many rabbit holes you can go down with this story. And I think we're very fortunate to have the great work of Mark Lewison, because Mark is, his day job, mine's to be dean, and I'm proud to be dean here at Monmouth University. Mark's day job is to work on these facts. And thankfully, because of him, we're able to go in and get some means of having a central repository of what we might call truth, right?
Yes.
So at least we have a place we can work from, and Mark has created those opportunities, since the 1980s.
So you were a fan primarily, I take it. You were a big fan of the Beatles before you started really looking into them in depth and really finding out about their history. So was there anything that changed? Did your opinion change at all when you were really delving into this?
Well, certainly. And I don't know if I was a fan actually that long, because what happened to me was I discovered them much later than most folks. It was in the late 1970s. They interrupted my breakfast routine, and then the Beatles cartoons came on, and I was immediately struck by the fact that they sounded so much differently rather than what I was hearing in the late 1970s on radio. So I became interested as a fan, but also as one who wanted to understand why they were different, what made them special. So even from my earliest days of listening to them, those sorts of issues were present. As far as what I've discovered by working on these books, one of those things, it really is just how difficult it was to do the work they were doing. There was nothing easy about what the Beatles were doing with George Martin. You know, they were putting hours upon hours into these projects, but also working so very, very hard to refine the sound that they were capturing. Another discovery was, you know, not a surprise, I guess, in retrospect, but wasn't what I expected. George Martin was a fabulous politician, and he had to be to work inside that band. You know, he would ride the waves, the ebbs and flows of power. You know, different Beatles, usually Lennon or McCartney, would be sort of driving the band. He would have to ride the waves of their level of interest and passion. These are 20-something guys he's dealing with who are being pulled in all sorts of directions, so he has to deal with egos. There were times, in his own words, where he would assert himself, but at other moments he would retreat and allow them to fill those power gaps. Just very fascinating how he would do this. Even with the White Album, which we're celebrating right now with its 50th anniversary, George retreated quite noticeably in the fall of 1968. He went on vacation, and by doing so, gave them some space to, you know, be these 20-something guys who are trying to find their own voice and their own vision. But he comes back, of course, in the nick of time to do the very important cleanup work that many of the tracks on the White Album needed, where he could help them make better decisions about orchestration and the choices that they were making about directionality for a song.
Well, the Beatles, you know, we see them in clips and we hear interviews of them, and they did mess about quite a bit, and, you know, they loved to laugh. But George, he did seem different. You know, he seemed a bit more professional. I don't know if maybe that's the right word, or like you said, political. He did always have a sort of business cap on. Did you ever find that he would let loose when you were doing your research, or was he always the straight talking professional producer?
That's a great question, because it was one that I asked almost everyone I talked to. And that is, did you ever see George lose his cool? Did you ever see George become upset in some way? Because he was in such control. And I'm sure, like me and Beatles music lovers throughout the world, we've seen George so many times on YouTube, in the anthology series, even going back to the 1980s and the various programs that were made at that point. And he always seemed so genial, so in control. And so what I was trying to understand is, what were the things that set him off? And it tended to be when people were not taking their work seriously and treating it as an afterthought. A very good early example of that was at the King George Fifth Hotel in Paris in January 1964. They were working on a project, and the Beatles were messing around. And he lost his cool with them then. This famous moment, I believe in July 1968, where he gets upset with them because they're getting upset with each other. And, you know, those moments he would sort of show you that he's human too. But he recognized, as they did most of the time, that they were doing something that was bigger than themselves. You know, they were making a real and enduring kind of art. And that is a huge thing and a powerful thing. And there was a reverence for their achievement that they tended to share, where they would fight, and they would fight hard over protecting that legacy. And I really admire that, you know, because that's the greatest aspect of artistry, is knowing you're doing something and that it's very important. To me, that's the definition of brilliance, right?
Yeah.
Real smart is knowing that this thing we're doing right now is really important, and we're gonna really make this work. There's a great moment in January 1969 where George Harrison has returned to the band, and, you know, there were all sorts of squabbling during those sessions. But when he came back, he sort of pounded on his chest and he said, heart of hearts, this is where I should be. And I love that because he's realizing that even though he has his ego wrapped up in these issues, even though he gets mad as hell, obviously at Lennon and McCartney at times, he knows he's supposed to be there, and he knows it's important to make that art.
Did you find out anything about how George felt or how he reacted when the Beatles did come to the end and the members went their separate ways?
You know, for George, there was I think, a clear sense of relief. He had really had it. It was hard for him to watch that dissolution. He had serious business he needed to conduct with his own company, Air. And I think he was exhausted. If he has a reaction, it's probably a lot like Paul McCartney, who was mourning the Beatles' loss. But George really could see it coming. That's why he was so grateful that they were able to right their ship, if only briefly, and make Abbey Road. You know, when you go back and you look at his comments and his interviews at the time, he really was exhausted by the whole business and this kind of emotional turmoil that they've been going through for quite some time, and really since Brian Epstein had died, for sure.
Do you see, a really big shift in his early life and then his later life? I know you sort of split the biographies up into two different books. So what was the main difference you see in what you found out?
Well, his later life becomes not so different from theirs. Obviously, they all have their different highs where they're topping the charts. All four Beatles will have #1 songs as solo artists, and George Martin will, to his credit, produce several #1 songs, and some are by, of course, Paul McCartney. But the larger point is that, like them, after the breakup, he is less. They were the sum of their parts, and one of those parts was George Martin. The others, of course, were John, Paul, George, and Ringo. And once they go their separate ways, they're all sort of scarred by the same issue, and that is that they really were better together than they were separately. But of course, you know, any of us can imagine being 28 or whatever, and you're there in the moment of the breakup of the Beatles. You've had this adulation. The world has adored you for your songwriting. At a certain place, you're thinking, well, I can always do this, right? Because, you know, come on, I'm me. You know, this will always be successful because I am so integral to this enterprise. But we're usually kidding ourselves when we say that, right? The moments where we're working on a really good team are usually the best. And like the Beatles, George had to deal with the fact that he was going to live the rest of his life in these kind of secondary spaces.
Would you say it took a toll on his life negatively, or was it maybe the break he needed, like you touched on before?
Well, he needed a break in the sense that he had a business that had been built to some extent around accommodating his time with the Beatles. He needed to drum up new business. He needed to groom new artists so that he could continue his good work. So that was an issue with which he had to contend.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but I do think he had this recognition of the importance of the Beatles in his life. He gets brought back several times in the 70s, for example, making some of the compilations, the Hollywood Bowl album. In the 80s, he comes back for the CD process of making compact discs. But even those moments were filled with frustration because he would often have to really assert himself to get EMI to do the right thing on behalf of their most important clients. So those moments were not without being fraught with their own levels of frustration, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Just fascinating stuff. But what's great about George, and this is why I ended the book as I do, the last word is friend. And I do this on purpose because regardless of all of the experiences, sometimes negative, that George had, he really approached the rest of his life as being a friend to their legacy and the great music and art that they'd created together. And even when things wouldn't be going his way, he would still work hard for the art.
Absolutely. And also you touch on in your book about, some of his darkest secrets and things that you didn't see on the surface with George. If you scratch away at it, then, it all becomes so apparent. But to the everyday eye, nobody would be able to know what was really going on. And what were some of those, deep secrets or revelations that you found through your research?
Well, deep secrets, I don't know. George wasn't the kind to keep a lot of deep secrets, but he lived his life in compartments. He had, for a time, a family out in the suburbs and a girlfriend in the city, and he was trying to negotiate between these different kinds of worlds. And when we think about George, he had self-consciously altered his accent during the war years in order to do a bit of social climbing. And so, he was kind of used to living in these different sorts of spaces and in this kind of compartmentalized fashion. Sometimes that would cause trouble.
His rise to where he was to as a producer, that was quite surreal. It was maybe a place in his life where he never thought he'd see himself.
I think you're right in saying that. Now, once he got there, though, he expected, I think we all do this, right? He's human. I think he expected to be rewarded and lauded. There's a great moment that Ken Scott told me about, the wonderful producer who later works with David Bowie and, of course, worked with the Beatles. There's a great moment where he was waiting for a session to begin. The Beatles had arrived. They were waiting for George Martin, and usually George had been there early, and this was a kind of unusual day. And they're sitting there waiting, and Ken is sitting on the front stoop there in the Abbey Road car park, and Brian Epstein pulls up just as George Martin is walking up the steps. And they both look over and they see Brian's limo pulling up outside the car park. And of course, scores of girls are running up to get Brian's autograph. And, he almost seems like a young idol, right? A movie idol. And George Martin looks over at all this adulation, looks down at Ken Scott and says, "That should have been me." It was a strange moment. And Ken was struck by it because he, couldn't believe that this man, George Martin, who was so carefully controlled, was admitting something like that. But sure enough, George did believe that, he should be getting some of that adulation that the Beatles were experiencing during the height of Beatlemania.
Certainly when, he put so much of the work in almost behind the scenes with, without as much credit. You mentioned before about him being a bit of a social climber and changing his accent quite a lot. Do you feel he needed to do that more often? The more popular and successful he got, do you think he needed to live up to the standards a little bit more? Maybe
so. I think for George, that they say that it's the littlest slights that get to us. In the later years of the Beatles, he really was in a kind of Cold War with EMI. Even after he leaves to become a freelancer, they give him this terrible, terrible, tiny picayune rate of residual. And it's barely enough to make it work. The only reason it does work, that small percentage, is because the Beatles are moving so much product, right? So it does help George in that fashion. But beyond that, he really is taken for a ride on a number of occasions. He only starts making money in the 70s when he opens up professional studios and becomes a kind of proprietor. But because the Beatles weren't necessarily helping him to find fame and fortune in quite the same way as a member of their production team.
So what was the most surprising thing that really, sticks in your head when you think about all of the things you found out over the years?
Well, I was speaking to the wonderful John Kurlander, who's one of the great members of the Beatles production team, particularly on Abbey Road, and just him describing how George would deal with the late Beatles politics of the strife and stress in the studio, and that, he would, almost as a kind of suit of armor, he would bring in a big chocolate bar and a bunch of newspapers so that if it were going to be a particularly bad day and they weren't going to call on him to help them, he could sort of indulge in the chocolate and the newspapers, and he would share it with the other members of the crew. And he would wait until the right moment came along to help them with their latest recording. And I always find that pretty endearing because it suggests, some good, careful thinking and good politics by George Martin create those spaces of interaction when, in this case, there weren't that many left.
During the process, did you ever get a chance to speak to George?
I did not. I wrote to him as soon as I had a contract. And his representative said, George wishes you well, but he really has gotten to the point where he can no longer hear. And I was aware that his hearing had really become shot by that point. And, it was no surprise. But, you have to make an effort. I don't know how much he would have added to anything. When you live that long, you've really said so much of what you're going to say. And so much of what you are going to say should really be measured against those moments when you first said those things, right?
Yeah.
Because they tend to have the most truth to them. So I did make the effort, but I was not surprised at all that he wasn't up for it.
Mm-hmm. What about his family? I know his son is almost following in his footsteps. So have you managed to speak to him at all?
I have. Giles has been quite helpful. I've had questions that I've peppered over email, and Giles' friend and manager, a fellow named Adam, has been wonderful. The older son, Gregory, has been helpful, particularly for those early years where we don't have as many witnesses left who are able to tell us some details. So really, they were all quite helpful. I haven't had anybody who has, shut me out or anything like that. The problem with George's story is it's a long one, and, we're already at the point where it's difficult to find evidence. It really underscores the importance of keeping primary evidence when you're dealing with an important story.
Would you ever like to do the same with any of the other members of the Beatles?
I'm thinking about it. I would like to perhaps work on the stories of some of the production team. They're typically younger than George, who got into the business at a slightly older time. So, there still could be some stories that are told there. I thought of this because of my great conversations with John Kurlander, who grew up in St. John's Wood, really just around the corner from the Abbey Road studio. And you start to understand how their own lives did have impact on what was happening there in those great studio spaces.
Absolutely. Have you ever been to Liverpool? Have you ever made the trip?
I was there last week, so.
Oh right, yeah, you were in the US with your book. Yeah,
I come to Liverpool 2 or 3 times a year. I have adored what's happened with the docks and the way the city has just remade itself. And I was just reading about how Matthew Street even has some redevelopment plans, which I think are very smart,
Yes.
It reminds me over here in the United States of, believe it or not, Texas towns like Austin and Fort Worth, which have rebuilt themselves into these kinds of cultural locales. And Liverpool is just doing magnificent things. I'll be back there certainly by the summer and again in September of next year. I adore what's happening there. And, as important as the Beatles or even football can be to the story of Liverpool, you don't need to go there for either thing.
Mm-hmm.
They've got you have more restaurants than you can ever eat in. And the hotels are really stepping up their game. It's, it's an easy trip from London on the train. It's just a magnificent place.
Oh, that's great. That's great to hear you talk about the city like that.
It's from the heart.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much. Have you ever seen the Beatles perform?
I have seen Ringo many, many times and Paul many times. And in fact, I just saw Ringo at Radio City Music Hall here in the New York City area just a little bit ago.
Wow.
And I got to tell you, right before we left Liverpool a couple of weekends ago, we saw the Cavern Club Beatles. I have to say, I was told that they were wonderful. Those guys can really play. They're doing something quite unique there in the Cavern, in the sense that they're creating not even a look-alike kind of experience, which I think too many people worry about. They're a sound-alike band. They're sound-alike in the way that you should be. In other words, they can really play the songs.
Yeah, I'd much prefer that. I'd much prefer to see a band that, can really play to perfection rather than people that, put their wigs on and dress up in the Sgt. Peppers. And, it's all about the sound.
It is. And, I was struck by them in the sense that they play like the Beatles would be a working band today. They've got big amps, big sound. The rumble of I Want to Hold Your Hand reminds you that it's not just a silly pop song. It's a song with serious low end. It was quite impressive.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to speak to us. And it'd be great if we can get you on to speak a little bit more. Maybe next time when you're in the city, you can pop into the studio.
You got it. I'll look you up for sure.
That would be great. Thank you very much, Kenneth.
Oh, thank you. Bye.